Early African Civilizations, Songhay and Other African Civilizations. Social Science Section 3. Songhay. Although Mali continued to exist into the 1800s as a small state, control of the desert trade passed to Songhay, whose people trace their origins back to the 600s CE. Its rise to power began with the imperial policies of its founder king, Sunni Ali, who from his base of Gao conquered Timbuktu in 1468. Within a year after the death of Sunni Ali, Mohammed Askia seized power in a coup. During his rule he expanded the borders of Songhai, reorganized its government, and reformed Islam. Unlike the Mande of Mali, however, the Songhai ethnic group was a minority in a multi-ethnic state. Their center of power was at their capital Gao, about 300 miles due east of Timbuktu on the northern bend of the Niger River, and the Songhai practiced Islam as their faith. Songhai eventually stretched from the coast along the Gambia River to the Niger River to the south, to Katsina and Agadez to the east, and to Tagaza in the north. As with Ghana and Mali, Songhai's power was based on trade, especially gold. Other exports included ostrich feathers, slaves, ebony, a hard black wood, and ivory. Imports included copper, iron, brass, sword blades, salt, and cloth. The rulers of Songhai enhanced Timbuktu as a center of Islamic studies by establishing a Muslim university in the city. Muslims from as far away as Arabia studied there. The historian Leo Africanus has left a good written account of Songhai. A Moor, born into the nobility in Granada, Leo Africanus later traveled widely in Arabia and northern Africa. He visited Songhai several times, perhaps as early as 1509 and as late as 1515. In about 1518, pirates captured him on his way back from Egypt to Spain, and then gave him to Pope Leo X as a present. The pontiff freed him and convinced him to convert to Christianity, whereupon the new Catholic took the Pope's name. Pope Leo X gave Leo Africanus a stipend and encouraged him to write. Leo Africanus added a knowledge of Latin and Greek to his mastery of Arabic. Leo Africanus wrote his description of Africa in Arabic and later in Latin. In this text, he described life in Songhai. He noted that societies in Timbuktu and Gao had a very few wealthy rulers and merchants, while the vast majority of the populace was very poor. Women covered their faces with a veil. Corn, cattle, milk, and butter were available, but salt was scarce. The king maintained doctors, judges, and Muslim clerics at his own expense. The coin of Timbuktu was unmarked gold, but for some small transactions, cowrie shells from Persia were used like coins. The king greatly promoted the creation and sale of manuscripts, as had Mansa Musa before him. The end of Songhai came suddenly in 1591 when a vastly outnumbered Moroccan army began to cross the Sahara in an offensive against Songhai. Though the Moroccans were outnumbered, they had the significant advantage of gunpowder technology in the form of cannons, and an early form of a rifle called the arquebus. In the Battle of Tond Ibi, just outside Gao, some 4,000 Moroccans defeated 18,000 cavalry and 9,000 infantry fighting for Songhai, and then sacked Gao and Timbuktu. Thus, the last of the three major West African empires ended just as the Atlantic slave trade was about to significantly expand. Ghana, Mali, and Songhai have several common characteristics. Their power depended on regulating trade north across the desert. Much of that trade also relied on access to at least one of West Africa's three major gold fields of Bambouk, Bure, and Akan. All three empires affected Mediterranean economies to the north. Third, their rulers demanded only allegiance and tribute, which meant control from the center was rather loose. Finally, Africans inside the empires largely retained their West African cultures while becoming part of the Islamic world. The effect of Islam on ordinary people varied, but the rulers and their advisors were usually Muslims. Thus, Islam helped solidify state power. Kanem Bornu. Although it was not directly linked to the three Western empires, a similar state developed in the vicinity of Lake Chad. About 1,000 miles east of the Timbuktu-Sijilmasa caravan route was another north-south route across the Sahara. Once loaded with bilma salt, the Tuareg headed south to the land of the Hausa in northern Nigeria to trade salt for Hausa goods before returning to their locations across the desert after traveling some 1,500 miles. For centuries, Tuareg have carried out a similar caravan trade with the Sahara oasis and salt depository of Bilma, located about 350 miles north of Lake Chad. The north-south Saharan trade provided the revenue that sustained the kingdom of Kanem, located northeast of Lake Chad. Kanem was founded by pastoral clans from the Sahel, who converted to Islam by the 11th century. Although they had no access to gold like the empires to the west, they controlled a much shorter trade route to the Mediterranean coast. By raiding non-Muslim Bantu from further south, Kanem obtained a supply of human slaves whom they brought out on a long march across the desert to the Libyan coast, where they were exchanged for horses and later guns, which were used in war to capture more slaves. Kanem reached the height of its power from 1210 to 1248 under Mai Dunama Dibalami, and then began to decline. Bornu, a state south of Lake Chad, which made tribute payments to Kanem, rose to take its place in the 14th century. After a civil war forced the leaders of Kanem to flee to Bornu, it became independent and served as a launching pad for the reconquest of Kanem. By the 15th century, Bornu was the capital of a revived Kanem Bornu and was strengthened by its ability to attract gold traders from Akan. It remained powerful for nearly 2 centuries after the fall of Songhay, but declined after desert Tuareg, armed with guns, seized control of the Bilma salt mines in the 1750s. Other types of African states. Throughout Africa, and indeed throughout all human history, the basis for state formation involved an exchange between leaders and followers. Leaders provided law, security, and organization for their followers, in exchange for the means needed to operate the state. For example, in our modern-day nation, people pay taxes, the means, which pays for the army, the police, judges, people who inspect our food, and so on. In the savannah states like Ghana and Mali, traders paid for access to transshipment points, which enabled them to trade more profitably, while others paid for access to the goods brought there by traders. Much of what we think of as taxation took the form of gift-giving and doing favors, and there were many different ways for people to participate. For example, in Central Africa, the Luba people occupied an area that produced valuable minerals, so other groups gave them presents in exchange for the right to extract minerals. At some point in their history, members of other groups married members of the Luba, creating a new form of exchange, wedding presents, and favors owed to members of one's families. Over time, those marriage networks expanded to cover much of the Congo River basin and extended south into present-day Angola. Other groups formed around the herding of cattle, which took place in areas that were too dry for farming. As a means to accumulate wealth, cattle and other livestock are unique because they produce more cattle when they breed, and humans can get food from them without killing them. Thus, a cattle herd was a source of wealth that increased over time, and the ability to give cattle as presents provided a way to attract followers. The 19th century Zulu of southern Africa took this approach to its highest level, creating a state that, for a time, was able to prevent Europeans from conquering their land. Long before the Zulu were a powerful force, the Shona of southern Africa had created a state based on cattle that became powerful enough to control the trade route between the Indian Ocean coast and the gold mines near the Zambezi River. As their power increased even further, the Shona constructed Great Zimbabwe, also known as the House of Stone, beginning around the 11th century. It is comprised of 3 parts. The most impressive part is the oval-shaped great enclosure with walls skillfully constructed without mortar, some 30 feet high, that likely enclosed the residence of the king. The second section is the so-called Acropolis, from which the king could address the subjects in the valley below. The stone dwellings of the residents make up the third section of Great Zimbabwe. Since the late 19th century, teams of amateur and professional archaeologists have found evidence linking Great Zimbabwe to international trade carried out by the Swahili some 250 miles due east on the coast. Section 3 Summary. Based on the Nile River and screened from outsiders by distance and deserts, Pharaonic Egypt lasted for about 2,000 years, Major themes in its existence included advances in agriculture, especially irrigation, writing, engineering, commerce, and religion that promised either reward or punishment. As the centuries passed and Egypt became less isolated, the absolute power of the pharaohs declined. Egypt was eventually conquered by various foreign powers, including Alexander the Great. The first great West African empire was Ghana. It amassed enormous wealth by taxing trade between the desert to the north and the savanna to the south, especially the exchange of salt for gold. That wealth financed alliances based on tribute that formed the basis of Ghana's power until Muslim Almoravids from the north, who sought control of Ghana's gold trade and conversion of its population to Islam, overthrew the empire in 1042 CE. The second great West African empire was Mali, whose foundation it memorialized in the Epic of Sundiata. Mali extended further south than Ghana, allowing it access to more fertile lands and more trade goods. Mali's rulers, called Mansas, encouraged the spread of Islam. One of Mali's most notable rulers was Mansa Musa, who gained great fame for his generosity, his promotion of Islamic scholarship, and his Hajj to Mecca. The third great wave of West African empires, Songhay, also taxed the commercial activities of caravans as they left or returned from Tagaza to Sidi-el-Masa. Like its predecessors, Songhay was influenced by Islam, brought from the north, but because it existed later, it also felt the influence of changes in Europe, notably the spread of firearms, which played a role in its conquest. Although ancient African empires' sparse populations and relative wealth meant that Africans experienced less insecurity than contemporaneous Europeans or Asians, throughout Africa, there are examples of individuals and families who attracted followers and solidified their authority by the ritual exchange of tributary gifts. One of the most impressive and most puzzling to Europeans was Great Zimbabwe, whose leaders used access to livestock and later access to gold as a means to attract followers. Others, like the Luba of central Congo, created states via intermarriage.